hundreds of years have they prayed the Lord's Prayer. One of the statements in the Lord's Prayer is being answered here during the tribulation time, because God is fulfilling that prayer. And, where God will set up his kingdom. And he is cleansing the earth, and he is preparing it to be setting up his kingdom. Thy kingdom come. When you pray the Lord's Prayer, when you say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Do you know what you're praying? You're praying for this to be answered here in Revelation chapter 7 and 8. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's preparing the earth to set up his kingdom. And all of the prayers of all these saints through all these hundreds of years is going to be answered one of these days. You know that? When God does set up his kingdom. Okay, let's go ahead and look at verse 1 and just read through real quick, and we'll get into this. If I can just keep myself on subject here, right? You know how I am. I get on something, and then one verse pops in my mind, and there I go again. That's what happens when you get old. Okay, verse 1. When he opened the seventh seal, there was a silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of the saints, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth, and there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Then my Bible says at verse 6, the trumpets. And it says in verse 6, then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. Because of this, a third part of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Verse 10, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, verse 13, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels. In other words, on this last verse, this eagle flying out says this woe, woe, woe. Some interpretations call it an angel, some say an eagle. But for whatever, they're warning the inhabitants of the earth that people, you think the first 4 trumpets were bad. Wait till you see the last 3. And of course, we won't get into that tonight, but they will be in the next chapter. And we'll discuss that here in a little bit. But let's go back and look at verse number 1. At verse number 1, it says, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. And, we've went through this several times. And what we seem to see here is this is kind of like a play that's unfolding, and you're like watching a school play, and you see this drama or whatever, and you see all of a sudden, the play will come to the end of a scene, and then the curtain is drawn, and then there's preparation for the next scene of events, and then the curtain opens up, and the next scene of events happens. And what this is really trying to tell us is that there's a silence. There's a great silence, just a silence where you can hear everything. You can hear a pin drop, and this is a kind of the what I would call the calm before the storm moment. Something catastrophic or devastating is about to happen, and there is a silence. But before introducing the 7 trumpet judgments, there is silence in heaven for about 1/2 hour. So, kind of an interesting statement. Something big is coming, people, and there is silence in heaven. Heaven is preparing for this. Verse 1 states that the 7th seal contains 7 trumpets. 7 trumpet judgments. We will later find out that the 7th trumpet will consist of 7 bowls of wrath that will be poured out upon the earth. This same scenario plays out to be sequences of events that will be poured out upon the earth, with breaks and pauses and intermissions between the various events. We see this example in 8:1, where there is a silence for about a half an hour. And we also kind of saw a little bit of that in chapter 7, where we saw these 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or any tree. And, it's kind of like the silence before something is fixing to happen. There is a silence for about a half an hour, the calm before the storm. There is coming devastation, and important events are coming. In verse 2, let's read on. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Isn't that amazing in Revelation how many times we've heard the number 7, which a lot of times I think points to completion. But here we have 7 angels who each have a trumpet and are standing at attention and getting ready to blow their trumpets and unleash great havoc upon a rebellious, sinful, evil world. But in verse 2, 7 angels are standing before God, and each are given a trumpet and are preparing to sound judgment upon the earth. Now, I did a little bit of a background on the info of trumpets that are in the Bible, and I'm not going to read all of these verses, but I'm going to give you a lot of verses, and you can you'll have this on tape, and you can go ahead and you can research this later on. But there are basically 2 types of trumpets that I know of that are all the way throughout the Bible. One deals with a ram's horn, and we find that in Joshua chapter 6, verse 4. There might be some other places we find this stuff too. I'm just giving at least 1 or 2 examples of each. We also find silver trumpets mentioned, all the way throughout the Bible, and one example of that would be Numbers chapter 10, verse 2. And of the various types of purposes in the Bible that these trumpets are used for, we find that one reason would be regulating the children of Israel. We have those accounts in Numbers 10, verse 2, also in Numbers 10, verses 5 and 6. Another purpose of trumpets in the Bible is for calling assemblies of people together. We also see that in Numbers 10, chapter 10, verse 2 and 3, and also in Numbers 10, verse 7. Another purpose is for blowing over sacrifices on the feast days. We see that in Numbers chapter 10, verse 10, also in Psalm chapter 81, verse 3. Another purpose in the Bible of trumpets is blowing at all religious processions and ceremonies. We see some examples of that in 1 Chronicles 13:8, 1 Chronicles 15:24, 1 Chronicles 15:28, and then 2 Chronicles 5:13 and chapter 15, verse 14. Another purpose of the trumpet is for assembling the people to war. And we see an example of that in Judges chapter 3, verse 27. Another purpose we see for the sounding for battle. We see that in Numbers chapter 10, verse 9, and also in Numbers 31, verse 6. Another purpose for the trumpet was to proclaim kings, the proclamation of kings. And we see that in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 13, and also in 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 14. Another purpose for the trumpet is for giving an alarm for danger. We see this in Ezekiel 33, verses 2 through 6. Also for service in the temple. Another purpose for trumpets. We see this in 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 12. Also for the priests to blow. We see this in Numbers 10, verse 8, 2 Chronicles 5:12, and 2 Chronicles 7:6. And also the blowing of the trumpets to celebrate the Feast of Trumpets. We see this in Leviticus 23, verse 24, and in Numbers 29, verse 1. And then also during the Jubilee Festival, when it was introduced, we see this in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 9. The sounding of the trumpet in the Bible is also used to illustrate one thing would be God's power to raise the dead. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 52, and in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. Another purpose of the sounding was the proclamation of the gospel. We see that in Psalm 89, verse 15. Another sounding of the trumpet was used to illustrate the bold and faithful preaching of ministers. This is done in Isaiah, stated in Isaiah 58:1, Hosea 8:1, and Joel chapter 2, verse 1. And then we see what we're reading now, we see the latter day judgments where trumpets are used. We see this in Revelation chapter 8, and then I think also some in chapter 9. So anyway, lots of places that trumpets are used throughout the Bible, and very important instrument. And we're reading about trumpets that are blown today in chapter 8 of Revelation. Okay, let's go ahead and get on down to verse 3. Okay, after we just read verse 2, I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And then in verse 3, we see another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense together with the prayers of the saints went up before God from the angel's hand. So we see here in verse 3 that another angel came and stood at the altar having a golden censer. The altar and the incense are symbolic of the prayers and the saints. And this altar that the angel is standing in front of is the real altar at the real throne of God, not the replica that Moses was given the plans to build on Mount Sinai. And this is what we need to understand, and I've talked about this before, but the plans that Moses was given on Sinai, when he was given the Ten Commandments is really just a replica of what's